Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our next Blue Waters webinar. My name is Maxim Belkin. I'm an education and training coordinator with the Blue Waters project at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Today I'm here with Scott Lathrop, Blue Waters Technical Program Manager for Education. And it is my pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Wickes today, who is here with us. She will talk today about computational data workflow mapping. And I would like to say a couple of words about Elizabeth. So her official job title is Data Curation Specialist. But in addition to that, she is also an adjunct lecturer in the Illinois School of Information Sciences. She's also a certified software carpentry instructor, and this is how I know her the most. And she's also a co-organizer of Champaign Urbana Python user group. So please welcome Elizabeth, and with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you all for having me, and thank you all for joining today. We'll be talking about a very analog tool to map and kind of organize your data processes. So this is, again, a very hands-on activity delivered via webinar, so maybe a little strange as we start. So as we're getting prepared and as you're getting settled in and getting your audio going, move that down. Okay, there you go. Please find or scavenge somewhere near your desk some number of Post-it notes and or paper as you desire, or nothing at all. And we'll be going over sort of some of the materials and things. So I want to talk first just about what do I mean by data workflows. So the goal of this workshop is to understand more about your project, on whether or not it's something that you're currently working on or kind of scoping ahead for next academic year. So knowing the tools you use, knowing the stuff, data, tools, kind of systems, whatever you have, where everything lives and where it's going. Within those 4 bullets, so tools, stuff, where things live and where things go, this is very much a choose your own adventure activity. So think about what is most important for you to know about your project. And this is something that we're going to flesh out a little bit more as we go. But start thinking about that and start thinking about your current projects. We're going to learn about just sort of how to map around, use these analog tools to map up your project workflows. Find sort of the pain points of your projects and identify where you might need to seek help or have extra clarification or do some additional research. And understand more about your collaboration within this project. If you have other people or if you're a lone wolf, you don't need to worry about it so much. But if you do work in a large group, this is an awesome activity to actually bring people together and make people talk. Like laptops away, cell phones away, your brains, your Post-it notes, your paper, and just start talking about your project and talking about your data. And then we're just going to kind of work through the materials. So preferred, if you've got them, a few pieces of paper. You can just get a regular piece of paper and draw squares or whatever is going on. Something to write with, pen, pencil, whatever. If you've got several colors, we can probably make use of that. And then if you've got Post-it notes, if you've got several kinds, maybe I'm the Post-it note nerd and have a bajillion Post-it note colors. If you don't, use what you've got. Otherwise, then if you only have a piece of paper and a writing instrument, we can make that work. And you can always just use your imagination and sip on your coffee and continue to wake up, because it was maybe a little early for some time zones. So before we move on to actually sort of work through this stuff, sometimes this whole process can seem a little convoluted at the very start. So if you're skeptical but trusting, that's a good place to be. So put on your trust hats and just work through the process. And then, of course, you are your own person. You can choose to rebel at any point. So when we talk about our data and we talk about our workflows, we think about things in a very linear process. I've got my input, I've got source data, maybe I've got data from other people, maybe I'm harvesting it myself. Then I do stuff to it, so I've got processes that I unfold upon my data, and then information and science unfolds back upon me. And then we have our output. So we have output data, we've got analyses, images, viz, and then publications and all this stuff. And so it's very like boom, boom, boom that we normally think about these things. If we think about those in terms of actions, you can have, you ingest, and then you clean and train and test, and then you have our analysis. But still, this is very linear mock-up. But in the reality of science is that you've got some input data and you do a whole host of stuff, particularly in very iterative processes like machine learning or data mining, et cetera, where you have to just keep looping and testing and refining until you have what you need out of it. And then, of course, at the end, we have our output data. And in this middle point, we kind of, at the end, after the fact, you say, oh, I did science to that. And so we kind of lose track of all of these bits and pieces that we've done in here, and we just say, oh, I did science to that data, and now I have a publication, and I'm done. But the goal of this workshop is to actually unpack all of the bits and pieces that you're doing and you're making in the course of doing your science. So we're gonna start thinking about a single project that you have, something that maybe you're just finishing up, something that you're actively inside of, or something that you're maybe planning for next year. So you can use this very prospectively, so something that has yet to happen, or something retrospectively where you're kind of more picking up the pieces. If you don't have a singleton project to work on, you can think of this in terms of general projects. So generally speaking, our projects work do-do-do-do-do. I mean, you can think of it that way. So the intention of this is to think very high level. We're not here to capture every single thorny detail that's ever happened to this. We want to find the big pieces. And what are the big pieces to you and big pieces to others are going to depend on your perspective and what's going on. So there are no right answers to this. There are right answers to you and to your project. And so this is very choose your own adventure, as I've said. So I'm going to give you a framework to start off of, and you can change things however it makes sense for your work. This is a tool to be useful to you. So if you don't agree, if something doesn't work for your project, change it, do something different. We're going to start very, very high level because usually these projects are very long and involve a lot of moving pieces. So if you start at the high level, then you can start figuring out where you need to drill down for more detail later on. When we get into kind of writing down things, we don't have a whole lot of space. So try to think of like very specific, short, meaningful names you can give things that you'll understand both now, in 5 minutes from now, and then 6 months from now. So when we are thinking about and framing up our workflow, we have sort of 3 questions to address. What kind of evidence? So you have this research question in mind. Like, we don't often, maybe I do, just kind of dive into data and see what happens with it. But usually you have some sort of research question, and even that's like, what do you have for me data? You've got a question going on. So think about what is the evidence you're looking for or trying to make to help answer your research question. What are you going to do? Are you going to be writing scripts? Are you going to be making data, making databases, making more physical objects or processing samples, et cetera? And then what are you, so like the activities, and then what are you making? So this is where, when you're talking about computational artifacts of the research process, this is where doing and making get a little hairy, because you're making things that you're using. So you're going to make this script that you're going to be using on your data. And so as far as where to put and classify those things, that's sort of up to you and sort of how it impacts your own workflow and what's the priority for you. So again, trust hat time. Please roll with me for a little bit, and then you can choose your own path forward. So we've got this, and I think I can switch the camera to, I normally do this workshop with this giant piece of craft paper that I give out to attendees. But if you've got a piece of paper of your own on your own desk, or you are really comfortable mocking stuff up in Lucidchart or something like that, in your piece of paper, take a moment to divide it into 3 zones, sort of 2 horizontal lines. You're going to want more room in the top part and more room in the bottom part than you will in the middle. And so once you have this piece of paper, then we can go back to the slides and think about, so in the top zone here, you're going to have, or I can have this lovely pen pointing, there we go. So you can see it maybe in the window. So at the top zone, you're going to be noting what you're making. So you're going to be making maybe digital objects, maybe physical objects. As a pair, you might be making objects for you. And so when I say objects, I mean like make data, samples, viz, chart, diagrams, blueprints, whatever it is you're making in your research life. So sometimes you might care more about whether they're digital or physical. Sometimes you might care more about whether they're objects just for you, or they're sort of intermediate data that you need to write out just to put it on disk. Or maybe you care more about that there's something for others as well. So these are sort of 2 different options you can use. You can, of course, make your own as well. But my suggestion is, as you deviate, which I expect and hope you do, to make this something work for you, write down how you're deviating so you can keep track of things. This bottom zone here, we're going to be talking about what are you using. And remember I said it gets a little thorny as far as, well, I'm going to be making scripts that I'm going to then be using. I'm going to suggest if you're writing down, if you're creating scripts that you're using on your data, I'm going to suggest that you keep them here. If you just need me to say where they should go, I'm going to suggest they belong in the bottom. But of course, choose your own path. So if you have, so it says when you've been documenting the source or object data, what you're using, so what you're acting on, and then the tool you're using. And so you see all of these lovely different colors because these all correspond to different Post-it note colors that I have. This is also sort of the most extreme possible version of this workshop. You can do it with just a single color in about 10 minutes, just kind of doing some general brainstorming, which is also how I run it at other workshops for a quick activity. But this is like the most expansive version you can do, so you can always backtrack from there. And so we've got this light blue and dark blue for sort of the objects that you're making, the pink and the yellow down here for your source data and the tools that you're using. And then moving towards the middle, I have my big Post-it notes to describe the activities. So these are going to be your action statements eventually. And then we'll be introduced to what the red ones mean sort of towards the end. So our first step, though, is to think about the actions that we're doing. And so we're going to be working through this step by step, and we're going to have time to work as well. And again, make this your own, write down, if you're changing it, write it down so you remember what's going on. So as the first step, I'd like you to lay out, I usually say start with 5 plus or minus 2. Again, we're thinking very large scale. So lay out about 5 of the big Post-it notes, or you can be drawing boxes on the paper, but just start with 5. If you've got an erasable pen or a pencil or something, or you've got other scratch paper, of course, it's easy to change. And if you've got Post-it notes, that's the value of using Post-it notes here, is if you end up disagreeing with yourself, they're Post-it notes, you just change them. So on each of these Post-it notes, I want you to think both from the start to the end of this project. Now, if you have a very large project, I would suggest stopping just before you start the publication process. So when you're doing your actual analysis. So not including sort of the writing and drafting sections, but actually just the core research process. So, sometimes it's helpful just to start writing down, like, what's the first thing that you're going to be doing, and then what's the last thing, and then kind of filling things in the middle. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to just kind of write down some action statements. So for example, we see in the slides, like, harvest data, split the data packages up. I mocked this up based on a large XML harvesting project that I did, where I was gathering in like several 100,000 core XML files that had to be split up into a couple million constituent XML files. So harvesting the core data, splitting the data packages up, data exploration, extract the values that I want out of them, and construct the data file for analysis. And then you can be very, very general if you want, and just say, like, I don't really know, I'm just going to be doing my math and science on this, and come to my own conclusions on things. So you can be both very specific, if that makes sense, and then be very general as needed. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. Please start filling in your Post-it notes. And if you have questions, I think you can pose them in the room, and Maxime will read them off to me. I can't see the room, though, myself right now. So So one other suggestion with these, think like short action resume bullet point style statements. Then if you find yourself sort of in a non-linear path and you need to annotate, you can use a smaller Post-it note or additional Post-it notes to say, my exploration and my extraction process here, loop. Or you can add in, so fuss with this structure however you need to represent the process the best to yourself. So I'm going to keep going. There's going to be plenty of time to keep working on these if you're still writing things down. So as you're sort of finishing up your first pass of these, take a second look at it and decide if you need to fuss with anything or add a little bit more detail to yourself about like where things live or what do you mean, adding any clarifying statements to yourself to help you understand it better. Now, if we take a higher level look at what we've just done, we can see that each one of these big Post-it notes or big squares that you've drawn on your paper and filled in sort of makes a column. This is sort of like a little CSV of data that we've made. So you've got a column belonging to each one of these big center Post-it notes. And then for each column, so for each individual big Post-it note in the center, we're going to start, and I'm going to take you through it, but we're going to be starting to document the things that you make, the resources that are made for this activity, and the resources that are used for this activity. We're going to start with this bottom section first, and then we're going to fill up the top, and then we're going to start annotating it. But that's the general idea behind what's going on with these big Post-it notes. So, and I'm going to be using the small yellow Post-it notes for this. That again, you can do, as you see in the slide, you can start just writing smaller boxes or just bullet points, however it is that it works for you. You can also do this just as a bullet point list of activities and then have this as a sub-bullet point for each core activity. So in this one, you're going to be talking about the data resources that you're getting things in. So if you think you have data for each one of these, let me get this back in center here. You don't have to necessarily start with one yellow Post-it note for under each, because you may not actually have a source data, a data source for each activity, but you might, or you might have some other source object that you're using. In this example, I do for each, but it's totally fine to not have one. So for each activity, think about the data sources that you're using. So in this case, I gathered the core XML files from the OAI PMH data store API. And then, as you see on the slides, I have this sort of arrow referencing this one. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screens. So it's okay to add like other little annotations or be more casual about your references on here. And so just start filling these out and use your own words, but use names that you will understand. It's okay to put question marks to annotate it, otherwise to say that you're unsure about what it will be, because we'll be talking about that in a minute. So, okay, so take some time to fill these out. This is not a weird emoji. This is a ditto mark and an arrow. How well it comes in. So as you might tell from the mock-up of both the slides, I know that these post-it notes are a little bit hard to read right now. That's okay, I'm just kind of duplicating information from the slides. You might actually be kind of sticking, you might currently be in this process of this fourth post-it note here. And so you have like more specific information for the previous notes, and you might be kind of projecting what you expect to be doing in the later post-it notes, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, so moving on to the next. Again, there's going to be more time to work. I'm going to be shifting to my pink post-it notes. So this is where you're going to be talking about the tools that you're using. And so now when we talk about computational projects, there's another fuzziness here of like, well, what do you mean? But you, I mean the scripts? Do you mean the languages? Do you mean the modules, etc.? Whatever's most meaningful to you that you feel like you should document. If you are in a pure Python house or a pure R house, then you can presume that everyone knows it's going to be in Python. If you're in a mixed house, you might want to declare that this is using Python or R or any other system. If the modules are really important to document, you can use that, or you can use nothing at all. So you don't have to have a note under each thing. So start drawing boxes or bullet points under each of these. I'm going to go ahead and lay out my post-it notes for each. And just start writing down the names. Again, short but clear, something you'll understand. So you can write down, because you're going to have more room than I do in the slides. Hopefully you have better file names than the ones I have. But in this case, I have like the name of my like .py script, and then I have, okay, so I use LXML as my primary package to extract the data. And that's meaningful because there's many ways to extract. And so if I was telling someone how I did this, I can say I used LXML, and that's a valuable piece of information to convey to another person. This is another .py file. I was using LXML again. Maybe I can name another package, and I'm saying I'm going to explore it using pandas. Pandas again. And then, because I have it in this example, maybe I haven't done this yet, so I don't know how I'm going to analyze my data. Maybe I'm going to use R for that. So I'm going to keep going so as to not leave a huge amount of dead air happening, because this is being recorded, so you can always work back through it and pause the video during this pause. So we're going to now shift away from this bottom section to our top section. So remember, we have our activity statement here saying that, okay, I'm going to extract my data right now. I'm going to do that. Oh, a Sharpie, thank you. I'm going to extract from my big XML files using these tools, and now I can say what I'm making. So I'm using this source data and this tool to make the things I'm going to describe up top. So as I see here, use as many of these as you need. So you might need more post-it notes down here if you have a lot of data sources that you're merging. So repeat as necessary. And that goes for everything in here. Okay, so we're going to shift our attention sort of back to the beginning. And right colors, here we go. So in this case, I'm going to be making a differentiation between sort of my actual digital data files and sort of ephemeral information for myself that I want to keep. And so there's the data bits, and then there's sort of the notes to myself, and that's how I'm going to be doing this differentiation. So, and again, this is one where you might not actually be using two items or two different colors that might not be meaningful to you. So just do what you need to do. But for example, here, I'm going to lay out my two. So I know for this one, I'm using the API to make XML files. And for the documentation that I'm creating, I'm going to have sort of my metadata. about when I did it, sort of like the date I accessed stuff, and any other notes of what's going on, maybe the privileges that I had or my API key, etc. So do this for each. So in this case, we would read this as I've gathered the data using the API and this script that I made to create these big XML chunks. In this project, it was actually about 40,000 of these big XML files. And then I sort of, to notes to myself, I noted down the time and date that I started the extraction and how many days it took to gather it all in, and then other important metadata for myself. And then just keep going. So again, film it if you're not sure what you're going to be making. So for example, in this stage where I'm sort of doing my analysis, I don't really know the data file I'm going to be making if I am. So I can actually put in a big question mark if I'm unsure, and that's absolutely fine. In this case, in the analysis process, I know that I kind of use a journal and take notes to myself. So I can just say notes. And then question mark if I'm unsure. And then particularly if you're in the midst of stuff, you can be very, very general with this. You don't need to go ahead and like perfectly name things. And you don't also have to start from the very beginning. You can sort of fill things in as you're thinking about them. So I have more documentation on how I created this data file based off of these smaller ones. So So you can see that I omitted one down here because I didn't really have any notes to myself for this one. This is a pretty straightforward process for me, but I am creating, so this process created about 2 million XML files based off of these big ones in here. But for these, because these were sort of maybe more intellectual processes, I do have documentation for myself for each. Yeah, so this is a good time to just start filling out the rest of your board if you need extra time. I'll give you a minute to go do that. Okay, so now I want to introduce you to these red ones here. And this is one, if you have a second color pen, if you have something with like an alert color, this would be good, or if you have another color Post-it note, this is a regular full-size Post-it note, just sliced in half. We're going to take stock of the entire process that we've put out here, and we're going to start identifying the pain points. So for each, consider each of these steps independently and think, what haven't I figured out? What don't I know yet? What will I need to know? And just start writing down points where things are going to be difficult. And if you know what's going to be difficult, write that down. And then just stick that anywhere that's relevant to the area. I've never led this workshop and have anyone who didn't have any pain points somewhere in their project. So as you're writing down these pain point statements, next to each, write down a note of who can help you with that question. This might be another human. This could be your PI, an IT pro, your students, a colleague, a friend. But the goal is to identify the issues you think you're going to have and note, hopefully ahead of time, who can help you. So you know that, like, maybe I'm sitting right here in my project, sort of on stage 2, and I know in my final stage, I'm going to have questions about something, and I can identify, oh, I think my colleague knows something about this, and I know that pretty soon I'm going to be at a conference with that colleague, and I can ask them that question. So because you've already identified the issue, or at least some of the issues you're going to have, you can plan better for how to get those conversations started ahead of time, rather than, oh, in 2 days I need to figure out how to have this done, and I still need to track down who can help me. So now we sort of have our completed board. And at this point, we've got, depending on how you've done your things, you have a list of the constituent tools that you're making, maybe a list of the scripts you've done, a list of all of your data sources, a list of all of the data that you're making, if you're making anything like that, a list of sort of maybe ephemeral notes to yourself that you've done, and a list of all the activities. So at this point, you can start really utilizing this because you've mapped out your entire project, or at least parts of it. And you've got, so if you're kind of creating data documentation, this is a really good place to start because you've got stuff outlined at this point. So you can say for each step what the data sources were and tools that you used and what you made out of it, and sort of how all of these processes led to create this big CSV file that maybe you're using for analysis. And so you can say, like, not only did I use this big CSV file that I created, well, people will ask you those sort of painful questions at the conference of, like, well, how did you make that? And you're like, well, I gathered stuff out of here. Well, okay, this is how I did that. And you know all of the bits and pieces you have that you've created along the way. So now that we have our boards all completed, I also want to talk about sort of the final component of adding annotations to yourself. So this is also a good point. When you have it sort of ready and you're happy, get out your cell phone and take a picture of it to kind of capture it. So I've done it on big craft paper that I can actually tack up on the wall. My usual suggestion is take a picture of it, and if you sort of have that relationship to your PI or to your colleagues, email it or text it to your colleagues and ask them, like, is this your understanding of this project? Because when you do this inside of teams, let's say you have a team of 5, and you have everyone independently do this, you're going to see them expand their sections and collapse other people's sections. And so you'll better understand how they see the project. So for example, this is all about the data extraction piece here. All of these steps were leading up to the creation of this big CSV file. Well, if I was handing this off to someone to do this analytics in here, and I have my whole analytics process represented in one step, which might not actually be the case. I might have a lot of detail happening in this analytics section, but my big interest in it was the creation of the data file. So if I then had my colleague who is doing the analysis recreate this entire process, they might have all of this board represented in one Post-it note. So like, get data from Elizabeth, and then 4 different stages of analytics leading up to a final report. And so if you're a team lead and you've got students, or particularly if you have a group that's sort of all over the place and it's really hard to pin people down to have team meetings, have everyone do this independently, no talking to each other. At the very minimum, just lay out these center Post-it notes and have everyone describe the process of their data, and then have them email those pictures to you so you can understand people's conceptions of reality for that project. And you're going to learn a lot about it, because it might be the fact that, like, every one of us we make 5 of these diagrams, and it might very well be that you want to have all 5 diagrams in succession, and that's the actual true reality of how the data happens. It might be that you have someone does this and someone does this and someone does this one. And so if you're in the planning stage, maybe you've got your students hired for next year. So here's sort of options for annotations. So if you've got students hired for next year and you're kind of scoping out your sort of like fiscal year 18 research project, so you know these things need to happen. You might not know exactly what's going to be made or exactly what's going to be used, but you can say, someone's got to do this. In whatever platform they're going to be doing it, someone's got to do this. And maybe you know the name of that student, so you can, for each one of these, write down who's going to do it. So your students walk in August and say, like, what do you want me to do? You hired me, you're giving me money to be here and do research. What am I supposed to be doing? And you can say, like, here's my reality of this project. Here's the universe that you live in. And here's the particular planet that you're responsible for. You take care of this. We can also think about this from a timeline. So say in August, you start with this Post-it note. So we're going to start our data gathering. So like, hello, students, thanks for being here. Happy you're in classes, but we're really here to do research. So we're going to be starting this August 16th. We're going to be making these data files. And I know that in May, we have a deliverable due for in analytics, or at least we know that given the publication process, that we need to have this analytics at least started by February so that we can have something out of the door by May for that conference. And so if you say, I know this is going to happen in August here, and this needs to be February, then you can extrapolate which months these need to be due. So you say, like, okay, well, if I want this due at the beginning of January, that's probably not going to be happening because of the winter break and finals from the fall. So maybe I need to push this to be done in early December. So once you fill out the timeline, not only do you have when things need to be due, but you also have who's supposed to be responsible for them. So you can hang this up on your lab wall and welcome that new student. Here's some coffee. Here's what you're going to be doing with the next couple months of your life. And you've already got your due dates down. You know what's going to be happening. You can know if you've gotten off track. But of course, annotate this however you want. So in the smaller version that I run, we only do the center point, or we only work on the activities, and then on each one of these activity Post-it notes, we kind of jot down the name of the data that you're working with, and who's going to do it and when it's due. And that's something that can be done really quickly. Yeah, so that's actually all that I have. What questions are there about this? This is a good time for questions.
We don't have questions so far, but I do have a question for you. So what would you do in case of a emergency situation, something drastically changes?
It's like your grad student rage quits.
Yes, something like that. So what would you do in such a situation with
So we know that this is due in February, so we have sort of our final component is due in February. And if they quit on step 2, then you can say well, I expect you to have made maybe, depends on if you have access to their computer or not. If they just jet and everything's on their personal machine, we have heard cases of people needing to use legal to track the student down to get stuff out of them. At least you know what they should have been doing, so you can say okay, person who was working on step 3, you're not responsible for step 2. And if you know sort of theoretically what they should have been making and using, you can then go look for that. So that's always a hard question. There's a lot of variables. So.
Okay, so we do have a question on Slack right now. Is there a name for this strategy of workflow mapping?
I just call it workflow mapping. This is sort of my creation. So no, I don't have a more formal name for this other than workflow mapping or data mapping, whatever. I don't care. I don't have a name for it. But the slides, yeah, so I've been asked that before, and I don't have a catchy name for it that would probably omit vowels or something and have a Y in there. But the PDF, there's a PDF copy of the slides for how to do this yourself or how to take students through it that you can download and use. And all these materials are CC BY, so if this would be useful for your group, please.
Yes, by the way, could you please elaborate on why you chose this copyright?
CC BY?
Yes.
Okay. I believe in open access materials. And I do my best to produce all of my educational materials and release them open access so that everyone can have free use of them. I usually release all of my data into the public domain, so with CC0 declaration, and then anything that I write or produce CC BY, because we're all here just to do science and just get our jobs done. If you can give me attribution, that would be great. But I really want these to be reused. This is not a proprietary system. Like, you don't have to come to this campus to have this done. Obviously, this is being recorded. So educational materials are there to be used. So please use them.
Okay. Do you know anyone using this approach outside of campus, or?
I've only ever delivered this to internal to campus.
So now it is delivered to broader community. So let's wait. It looks like we might have one more question coming.
I've also run, sort of for my class, I have my students do a big programming project at the end, and I've run this at the midterm point when they're gearing up for their project. I've run this for them in that class to have them go about their final project. So this is a good, even just student project framework as well. You're not going to be necessarily as detailed, but yeah.
So I have to say that I know Elizabeth, as I said, as a software carpentry instructor most of the time, and it's always a pleasure to watch her teach specific topics such as Python, Bash, R, SQL, and now I'm even more amazed by Elizabeth because she basically has a big breadth of knowledge, I think, and it's just amazing. So the question is, we got probably one last question. I haven't looked at Agile, but is this similar to that? Is workflow mapping similar to that or not?
Maybe. I don't know. Everyone, there's always, so there's like uppercase A Agile and there's lowercase A Agile.
Uppercase.
Like, maybe. I'm not trained in uppercase A Agile. I just like, I throw it onto stuff and I get it done. And so I don't want this to be like a system, because I think as soon as you make a project management system a named entity, then it becomes too rigid. And this should be a flexible framework that you adapt for each project. I come from a project management background and then into tech stuff. And so this isn't based on anything in particular other than just like project planning stuff. So if it can fit into your use of Agile, totally. But it's maybe I'm not trained in it, so I don't know, actually. Someone who is more of an expert might know better.
All right, thanks, Elizabeth. It was actually a wonderful webinar. It was very unusual webinar, I'd say, but at the same time, we feel that these kind of webinars, they're useful to get the mindset right. If you are working on a big project and you need to map your workflow, you need to know how things work together. It is very important, and I think it's important for software engineers as well. So if we could show the final slide. Please note that there will be no webinar next week. So we will meet with you 2 weeks after. Our next workflow webinars will be on April 26 by Ilke Eltintas and Shweta Purawat, and is titled Kepler Scientific Workflow System. Here we'd like to note that we have an addition to our webinar series, and it's the next webinar will be May 3rd, this additional webinar. by Justin Wozniak and is titled Swift T. Well, it has actually a longer title, but for short, Swift T. After today's webinar, you will receive a short survey as usual, and we would really like to get your feedback because we're constantly trying to improve our webinars. With that, I would like to thank you all for joining us today and hope to see you next time. Thank you.